What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so getting into Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps, The Quest for Hope. The funny thing about this is that I accidentally deleted this recording. Like, I had this already done and everything, and then I accidentally deleted it. And I was like, no, because I tried all my recovery software in order to get it back, and I couldn't find it. And I was like, oh my God, so I've got to go back and re-record it. But the cool thing is that this is kind of par for the course. Like, I usually record audios a couple of times to make sure that I get all the points across, that I want to make. But for those of you guys who are new to the Green Lantern landscape, the way that DC Rebirth has done Green Lantern is in two different ways. We have Green Lantern's Rebirth, which is basically the new fan's guide to Green Lanterns. You literally learn about the Green Lantern mythos as Simon Baz and Jessica Cruz learn about it. Then there's Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps, and that's more for established fans. All it really did when when Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps Rebirth kicked off is it continued a lot of the stories that it just kind of had dangling plot threads at the end of Jeff Johns' run going into Robert Venditti's run, and so that was a goal to basically wrap those things up. And so what happened is Robert Venditti began the process of writing his own stories, of basically saying, here's everything that I'm creating for the very first time. And it's really, really cool because it comes together almost seamlessly. You could just follow the entire story because, again, Green Lantern, as it stands right now, is this massive 10 years long worth of just events. It's just this massive cosmology. But the idea here is that this initially picks up with a guy named Space Cabbie. Now, the funny thing about this is that Space Cabbie is not new. Space Cabbie's been around for a long time, but this fits directly in line with the nature of DC Rebirth, which is to say that we're basically talking about this point where DC is grabbing characters that had been around for a very long time, whether they were obscure, whether they were really popular, and basically either updating them or keeping them the same if they were that familiar. For example, Wally West, the classic Flash, came back and he's basically the same. When it comes to a character like Space Cabbie, he's about as obscure as it gets. This guy first popped up back in 1954 with Mystery in Space number 21, I think it was. I want to say he was an Otto Bender creation, but I'm not going to swear to that. But the idea was that Space Cabbie is exactly what he sounds like. He's a guy that ferries people across the universe. Now, DC kind of delves into these things periodically, and it's really just designed to kind of bolster the cosmic landscape of DC Comics. That was the original purpose of Space Cabbie, and that's the purpose he serves now. For the most part, whenever it comes to the cosmos, Green Lantern is about as extensive as it gets. We don't really see a whole lot of other stories out there that deal with like the cosmic landscape of DC. They're not like Marvel. Marvel, you'll read Guardians of the Galaxy, you'll read Captain Marvel, depending on who's writing it. You can read Thanos. You'll get this huge, well-rounded space, exploration. And in fact, the spacefaring escapades of the various characters that exist out there are usually done just as much as the Earth-based events. So you're just as likely to see a story of Captain America fighting the Red Skull as you are to see Thanos trying, fighting against Galactus and like overpowering him, which he did, and it was an amazing story. But the idea here is that Space Cabbie was a guy who's basically done everything. I mean, he's been a soldier of fortune, he's just been a ferryman, he's done all kinds of stuff. He lends his abilities to the highest bidder. The reason why he's in this story is because this ties in to the existing events that are going on in Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps. If you're just now joining the events, what effectively had happened is that we had basically Sinestro and Hal Jordan fighting one another for what was believed to be the last time. That was the idea. They've been enemies for so long. DC Rebirth was designed to kind of make a return to familiarity, but also begin moving things in a different direction. And the whole Sinestro as a backdrop, a villain to Hal Jordan, that had been going on for decades and decades and decades. And so it made sense that DC would come along and say, let's go ahead and back off and let's try something new. And so in the very first story arc of Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps called Sinestro's Law, Hal Jordan and Sinestro fought and they were both basically killed. Now the idea is that following the death of Sinestro, his daughter Saronic took up his mantle. Now if you're following our Green Lantern videos on Sunday, which is when we cover all the classic Green Lantern stuff that leads into DC Rebirth, what we know is that Saronic, as the daughter of Sinestro, was originally a member of the Green Lantern Corps. The issue is that eventually she became a member of the Sinestro Corps, but during Hal Jordan the Green Lantern Rebirth, with the death of Sinestro, she took up her father's mantle. But instead of being a bad guy, what she did is she worked directly alongside John Stewart and brought the Green Lanterns and the Sinestro Corps together. Now with regards to the Green Lanterns themselves, this again fits into a lot of the stuff that was leading into DC Rebirth. What had happened is that there was basically a story called Edge of Oblivion, I think it was. And it was essentially the Green Lanterns just kind of being catapulted, or at least what was left of the Green Lanterns, being catapulted all the way back to the very beginning of the universe. And the result was that in the present day, there were no Green Lanterns. The result was that Sinestro saw it as his chance to basically take the Sinestro Corps, have it masquerade as a peacekeeping force, all for the purpose of basically building on people believing in them. The idea was that once people looked to the Sinestro Corps as their protectors, Sinestro would betray them, he would instill fear, and then conquer the universe. But all that basically came to a head during Hal Jordan the Green Lantern Corps rebirth with Sinestro's Law. And so again, what this means is that at this point in the story, we basically have a strange situation. You have basically a lot of the members of the Sinestro Corps who despise the Green Lanterns, and you've got a lot of members of the Green Lanterns who despise the Sinestro Corps because they've been fighting for so long. Remember, when the Sinestro Corps first showed up, and again, I have Sinestro Corps War down in the description, you're welcome to check it out. When the Sinestro Corps first popped up, they started slaughtering Green Lanterns everywhere they saw them. It was an absolute bloodbath. It wasn't until it got to the point where it looked like Sinestro was going to win that the Guardians of the Universe adjusted the laws of the rings, allowing Green Lanterns to kill members of the Sinestro Corps. That turned the tide, and the Green Lanterns ended up winning the war, or at least they basically defeated the Sinestro Corps. But the idea is that following the defeat of Sinestro and all this kind of stuff that's going on right now, what this basically means is that the Green Lanterns and the Sinestro Corps have a very tenuous relationship, to say the least. But in that first story arc, with the death of Hal Jordan, what we found out was that Kyle Rayner as the White Lantern had essentially resurrected him. Now remember, as the White Lantern, Kyle Rayner has mastery over all the rings. He can do anything. I mean, he's basically God in DC's universe. And that's something that I want you to keep in mind for a second, because once we get to the end of this video, it's really going to showcase just how powerful Dr. Manhattan is. But the idea here is that with Hal Jordan having died, because he was kind of a rallying point for the Green Lanterns, what this meant was that the Guardians of the Universe needed him, or at least what was left of the Guardians, Ganthet and Sade, they needed him alive. And so getting with Kyle Rayner, having him reach into the afterlife and bring Hal Jordan back, while Hal Jordan was there among the dead, he had spoke with his predecessor, Abin Sur, the guy who had given Hal Jordan his very first ring. And Abin Sur's statement was pretty cryptic, to say the least, but he had simply just said, "Go find hope." Now, the initial indication here was that it meant go find the Blue Lanterns. And so what ends up happening is Hal Jordan alongside Kyle Rayner basically race off to a place called the Misery Mound. Now, the Misery Mound is basically just kind of a mountain, occupied by all these creatures and so on that exists for the purpose of just stripping people of their desire for hope. And that's the necessity, that's the nature of the Misery Mound. When it comes to the Blue Lanterns, of course, I imagine a lot of this might be new to people who are stumbling across this, but when it comes to the Blue Lanterns, they are a Lantern Corps predicated on hope. And they're probably the most powerful, just because hope is the only thing that people can have that will allow them to do anything else. With people like Atrocitus, for example. Atrocitus, as the head of the Red Lantern Corps, feels nothing but rage, but his rage is predicated on the hope that he can succeed in destroying all the other Lantern Corps in existence. So again, everything boils down to hope, and that's the reason why it is the Blue Lanterns are so powerful. But when the Lantern Corps were created by Jeff Johns back when he was doing his massive run, every Lantern Corps had to have a caveat, which is to say they had to have a weakness. And so the idea is that with the Blue Lanterns, they function at their absolute peak when they're accompanied by a Green Lantern. And that's why this is important, is because St. Walker, as the last remaining Blue Lantern, is powerful in his own right, but his power is bolstered and complemented by the Green Lanterns. And so with the arrival of Hal Jordan alongside Kyle Rayner, what this does is it basically begins the process of beefing up the abilities of the Blue Lantern Corps, beefing up the abilities of St. Walker. The problem with this is that when it comes to Blue Lanterns, and the reason why this Misery Mound is really happening, is because Blue Lanterns have to constantly feel hope. That brings us into the idea of the Blue Lanterns basically falling, of being eradicated. There was a story that was written, and I cannot remember what it was called for the life of me, but it dealt with a villain named Relic. And Relic was a guy who had come from a previous universe where the emotional spectrum had basically run rampant and then eventually just kind of went away. And the result was that all life in the universe, if I remember correctly, had basically gone. The result of this is that he had shown up in the main DC universe for the purpose of exterminating all the Lantern Corps, keeping their power from running awry, and then forcing the same result of his universe. The first Lantern Corps that he targeted were the Blue Lanterns. Now, the Blue Lanterns were the easiest to target because despite how powerful they were, if at any point a Blue Lantern does not feel hope, their ring will take off. Their ring will leave them hanging, and they'll just be as powerless as anybody else. Woe betide them if their ring leaves them while they're in the depths of space and they can't breathe. So because of that, during this whole skirmish where the Blue Lanterns were basically just falling left and right, St. Walker was the last guy left. Ultimately, St. Walker lost connection with his Blue Lantern ring, and the Blue Lanterns were were no more. Now, eventually he regained it, and what that did is it went into DC Rebirth. The problem was that when DC Rebirth first kicked off, we didn't know what Saint Walker was doing. We had no idea where he was or what was going on. There was no information on his character. What this reveals is that he's basically been off fighting the Misery Mound, and the Misery Mound serves the purpose of trying to relinquish people of their hope, of trying to exterminate all hope in their entirety. Now, again, because this is pretty new in relation to DC Rebirth, which is to say we're about a year and a half, 2 years out from DC Rebirth in terms of the lead up, the main event itself, all that kind of good stuff, a lot of folks are still jumping into Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps for the very first time. And so because of this, we're basically picking up into the idea of people learning about all this for the first time. And that's why this Misery Mound is here, to basically give people who are reading for the first time an understanding of what the Blue Lanterns are about. Now, the idea here is that with Hal Jordan and with Kyle Rayner basically being subdued by the Misery Mound, it shows us what it does. And again, the Misery Mound exists for the purpose of just taking people's hope away. But it's not like an energy thing, right? Like, it's not like it attaches these tendrils and says, now I'm stripping you of your hope. Instead, it's very much similar to like the Black Mercy plants, for example. You attach a Black Mercy plant to a person and they just see their perfect dreams forever and ever and ever, and they're basically just held prisoner until they die. With regards to this, a person is basically forced to see the one thing that they love the most, the one thing they would love to see happen. And then that beautiful future is transformed into a nightmare. In the case of Hal Jordan, he has a family, he has children, he has Carol Ferris at his side. And then suddenly that shifts into a nightmare where he goes back to being a villain and just everybody around him dies. When it comes to Kyle Rayner, he's basically the White Lantern. He's effectively DC's space Jesus. Because of that, he sees himself as a savior of all life, as a representation of all life, being a protector in the most definitive statement. The problem with this is his nightmare is falling down and becoming parallaxed, becoming a villain. Now remember, with these characters, they've experienced this kind of thing before. Kyle Rayner did become Parallax, the living embodiment of fear, during Sinestro Corps War. Hal Jordan has lost almost everything he cared about in some form or fashion. Friends, family, loved ones, the whole nine yards. And so the idea is that with them basically experiencing this horrible nightmare, Saint Walker, as a Blue Lantern, begins to empower them with hope, and in doing so, allows them to basically break free of the Misery Mound. So again, this Misery Mound is pretty powerful, but it's really the emotional connection that exists between these three lanterns that makes them able to beat the Misery Mound in the first place. Now, following this, it goes into a whole explanation of, hey, the Guardians of the Universe sent me out here in order to basically make sure that I could find hope, that kind of a thing. Because remember, Ganthet and Sade, as the Guardians of the Universe, were the ones who made the Blue Lantern rings in the first place. Now, their goal in terms of why it is that Hal Jordan came and why it is that Kyle Rayner came, again, hits back to the nature of the Blue Lantern rings. Blue Lantern rings can only function at their peak if they're accompanied by a Green Lantern ring. And so having Hal Jordan there was, one, because of the fact that he's the one that got the message from Abin Sur, but two, because if Saint Walker is in danger, his Lantern ring will bolster the power of Saint Walker's ring. Now, Kyle Rayner being there is because as the guy who's basically the nature of life itself, he can resurrect the dead. The goal of the Guardians of the Universe, the goal of Ganthet and Sade, is to basically use Kyle Rayner as the White Lantern to reach in and grab the life essences of those Blue Lanterns who perished from Saint Walker and resurrect them from the dead, using Saint Walker as kind of an anchor to do so, to go into the afterlife, to grab those guys, say, hey, you have to come back. And so that's the whole nature of this. That's the whole purpose of this entire story in terms of those characters. Now, what ends up happening here is that once this really begins to go into effect, we get a massive glimpse of what it is that Dr. Manhattan can do. Now, it's not explicitly stated, but we're effectively told that's the case. When it comes to Kyle Rayner and when it comes to him speaking with the Guardians, once they begin the process of basically using Kyle to try to reach into the afterlife and grab these Blue Lanterns, it should have been seamless. Go into Saint Walker's mind, grab the connections to the Blue Lanterns, speak with them, whatever it is that he had to do, and then bring them back. The problem with this is that someone gets in his way. Someone stops Kyle Rayner from being able to do this. We know that just because of the fact that the entire event come crashing down. Now, again, the biggest indication we're given here is that we run into Saint Walker simply saying, I felt a presence, an intruder that was barring our path. Now, when it comes to the White Lantern in DC Comics, there are characters that can overpower him. I mean, like the Presence, for example. Probably the Spectre. You know, there's a few characters out there that could overpower the White Lantern because they're just that powerful. We have no reason to believe that the Presence, the Spectre, the Phantom Stranger, hell, even Imperiex in the 1990s, we have no reason to believe that any of those characters have a reason to bar the path of White Lantern Kyle Rayner resurrecting the Blue Lanterns, resurrecting Hope. The idea here is that Dr. Manhattan is the one that's keeping that from happening. And it all fits into the very notion of the Blue Lanterns themselves. The Blue Lanterns embody hope. The Blue Lanterns are insanely powerful. The other half of this is that this sees the destruction of the White Lantern ring. Kyle Rayner is no longer the White Lantern, and there are no White Lanterns anymore. That's the important thing about this. That's the biggest takeaway from this. And the reason why is because, let's say, for example, that Justice League versus Watchmen unfolds, and we've got Dr. Manhattan fighting the Justice League. There's been times, really, I think it was during Blackest Night or Brightest Day, there was a point where the entire Justice League became White Lanterns. They were all as powerful as Kyle Rayner. The biggest issue this represents is that if Dr. Manhattan shows up and Dr. Manhattan had to fight all these White Lanterns, it would be epic and it would be cool, but most people would look at that and say, sure, he could probably defeat Kyle Rayner, but no way he could defeat like 8 White Lanterns. That's ridiculous. And so why even go down that route? Why not just wipe out the White Lanterns in their entirety? That way you don't have to worry about this. The other half is that the White Lantern story arc of Kyle Rayner had basically reached his end. Kyle Rayner becoming the White Lantern was kind of this crescendo of his whole story, going all the way back to the mid-1990s with Emerald Twilight, Hal Jordan becoming a bad guy, destroying all the Green Lanterns, Ganthet showing up to Kyle Rayner and saying, you are the last of the Lanterns, here's a ring, use it wisely. All that led to Kyle Rayner becoming a White Lantern to this moment when he goes back to being who he was before. Because with the White Lantern ring being an amalgamation of all these other Lantern rings, what ends up happening is they all basically disperse. The White Lantern ring shatters, the other emotions form into their own rings, they disperse across the universe, and they start looking for new hosts. The only exception to that is the Green Lantern ring, which rebonds itself to Kyle Rayner, setting him back to who he was before all of this stuff, with the White Lantern ring all kicked out. And so the idea seems to be that he's kind of going back to the era of Ion, but at the very least, Kyle Rayner's character is going back to the beginning. It's kind of resetting everything back to zero to a degree. Now, it's not a reboot or anything like that. We'll probably see the White Lanterns return. That's the indication here. Dr. Manhattan is more powerful than the White Lanterns. That's the implication. But I'm kind of curious what you guys think. Do you guys think that's true? Do you think Dr. Manhattan is more powerful than a White Lantern? I'm just kind of curious about that. But with that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.